This is about the blameworthiness of the sinner, the blameworthiness of the unbeliever, and the character and the goodness of our God, who offers and brings a message of salvation, which I think needs to be true and real for it to be offered. You can't offer something that you haven't purchased. And so in order for God to really say, I want you to come, on our perspective, it needs to be a genuine bona fide offer. And I don't think Calvinists can offer that. I don't think Calvinists can say Jesus died for you and that God really loves you. Some Calvinists attempt to try to hang on to their Calvinism and still say those kinds of things or still promote that kind of doctrine. I don't think it's consistent. I don't see how it's consistent.
The Calvinistic approach is God predestined you based on his will and what he wants. That's about it. He chose who will be saved, at the very least in the Augustinian sense. Everybody's on their way to hell, and then God elects these people he's going to rescue. If you go beyond that, some folks would argue in what's called double predestination, where he elects those to salvation and to damnation. Which is a disagreement that Calvinists have amongst themselves as to what the issue there is. Some might even criticize and argue that and saying, well, by doing one, you are by default doing the other as well. That's a critique. The Armenian view of election is God kind of having this foreknowledge or looking into the future and then seeing that you would freely choose and therefore electing you. And that's what the election looks like. How is the provisionist different than these two views when it comes to election?
Yeah, and I think you're right in the way that those two views have typically been explained and characterized. I would say, just as a point of clarity, though, that even among the Armenians, many of the Armenians that I know of, like Dr. Brian Abishano, the president of the Society of Evangelical Armenians, Dr. Roger Olson, who works at Truett Seminary here in the state of Texas, who is a friend of mine, neither one of them would characterize their view, even as Armenians, as God looking through time to see who is going to believe. That's a kind of a caricatured way of looking at it. You mentioned Molinism earlier. I actually think the Molinistic perspective gives a better philosophical way of comprehending that God knows who is going to believe because of his divinity. He's divine. Correct. He's God. He doesn't know it because he's peering into the future to learn something. He knows it because he's divine. He's at all places at all times.
Actually, at ETS, I sat through a session where they were speaking about how Jacob Arminius was influenced by Molina, and that was what he had in the back of his mind. The reason why I don't want to get into the details of this, because then we're going to have a conversation about God and time.
Yeah. And I totally respect that. Yeah, totally respect that, because that can get really, yeah,
and we'll get really hairy real quick.
I just feel like I always have to say that, because I know Armenians get really, really persnickety when their view is caricatured as God, looking through the quarters of time. Because in fact, you mentioned Logos, and when you do a search of all of the Christian history of all of the many articles, and Dr. Pritchett there with Trinity Seminary, who I work with, he has the biggest library with Logos that's available, and that's thousands upon thousands of books. Yes. And he did a search. He did a search for the quarters of time, because that vernacular of God looking through the quarters of time. Mm-hmm. And the only people he could ever find saying that were Calvinists describing Armenians. He could never find an Armenian describing their view that way. And so I think it's important to represent the perspectives correctly. And Absolutely. So even as provisionists, there are different views among provisionists and Armenians. None of them are monolithic groups. Everybody holding the exact same perspective.
And this is partly, I don't know if... Sorry, but this is partly because we have different views when it comes to God's relationship with time. Like the view I tend to hold of God and time is different. And it would be very difficult for me to hold like an Augustinian view on this stuff, because I just disagree on his whole time view of things.
Right.
So let's come back to this concept and speak about the provisionists and an election.
Yeah, and again, the Armenian might hold to more. I know Dr. Abishano holds to more of a corporate view of election, mm-hmm. which is very similar to the way I would describe it as well. And the concept of predestination as being kind of similar to that. And the way I've described it before is to say that on Calvinism, God is predestining people before they're ever created, before they're even born. He is predestining what they will believe. He's predestining if they will believe in Jesus or not. That's what he's deciding before they're even created. And so he's actually not even choosing them for something. He's creating them to be believers, or he's creating them to be unbelievers. That's what he's destining beforehand. And what we would say is no, what Paul is talking about in Ephesians 1 most particularly is that God is destined beforehand what will happen to those who are in Christ, which is why he says he chose us in him. We are in Christ when we're chosen. That's the corporate perspective. You're either in Adam from birth, the flesh, or you're in Christ through faith. And if you're in Christ through faith, then God is predestined before time began that you would become holy and blameless, that you would be conformed into the image of his Son. And the best illustration I've given for this that people really seem to connect with is if I were to say there's a tower in the middle of the city, just a fortress, and an angel came from the Lord and said, there's a storm that's coming. Anyone who gets into the fortress will surely live, and anyone who stays outside the fortress will surely die. And the storm comes, and sure enough, everyone who listened to the message of the angel and who got under the fortress, they lived, and everyone who stayed outside the fortress perished. You can honestly say that prior to the storms coming, you could say God predestined for everyone who was in that fortress to live, and he predestined for everyone outside that fortress to die. But that doesn't say anything about God predestining who would and would not get into the fortress. And so that's the view of predestination that we as provisionists hold to, and many Armenians would agree with me on that, is to say that God doesn't destinate or fate who is going to get into the fortress and who's not. He's not determining that decision. He is inviting everyone to get into the fortress that is Christ. But it's your decision to get under Christ, to get in his fortress, so as to be saved from judgment that is to come. And therefore, God can predestine what will come of those and what will happen to those who get into Christ. But it's not saying that God has determined whether you're going to get into Christ or not. That's your decision. That's your responsibility, not God's. God's given you that responsibility. He's not the one causing you to stay outside the fortress through some causal means, whatever they may be described as, or causing you to get into the fortress through some whatever causal means that the Calvinists would like to use to describe that. He's not doing that on our view. He's saying, no, anyone and everyone can come. He's provided the fortress for anyone and everyone. Anyone can come to Christ so as to be saved. No one perishes because they don't have atonement provided for them. No one dies because God and goes to hell because God didn't really want them or didn't really provide for them. That's what provisionism is all about. God provides for every single man, woman, boy, and girl. Anyone who perishes ultimately perishes. As Paul himself said, they perish because they refuse to love the truth so as to be saved. They don't perish because God didn't want them, which is what the entailment of Calvinism ultimately teaches.
Is it necessary for somebody who is a provisionist to also believe in this corporate kind of election?
No, I think there can be people who hold to different perspectives of election in the way that it's described, who still fit under the larger mere provisionism, if you will. In fact, I wouldn't have any problem with Brana Bishano or other Armenians finding themselves under the provisionist label, because the provisionist label is really focusing on God provides. Some who don't know the history of this, I'm a Southern Baptist. And Southern Baptists were oftentimes referred to, if they weren't a Southern Baptist Calvinist or Reformed Southern Baptist, they were often referred to as a traditional Southern Baptist, meaning we hold to the traditional views of the Southern Baptist Church over the last 100 years or so, which mostly held to what a Billy Graham type of person or a Herschel Hobbs or Adrian Rogers would have held to. Sometimes they referred to as whosoever will kind of Baptists. And my broadcast was reaching far beyond the Southern Baptist Convention. And so it didn't really feel right to call us traditionalists, because we're not really based upon the tradition of the Southern Baptist Convention, because a lot of the earlier Southern Baptists were Calvinists too. And so that didn't really make much sense to me. And so I just kept focusing back on, well, God provides. Yeah, Oh, you think we're wretched, dead sinners? Okay, well, yes, but God provides for wretched, dead sinners. So it's all about God's provision on our view. God provides for everybody. And therefore, if anyone perishes, they don't perish because of a lack of provision, a lack of atonement, or a lack of God's desire. They perish because they refuse to receive the truth so as to be saved. It's their fault, in other words. This is about the blameworthiness of the sinner, the blameworthiness of the unbeliever, and the character and the goodness of our God, who offers and brings a message of salvation, which I think needs to be true and real for it to be offered. You can't offer something that you haven't purchased. And so in order for God to really say, I want you to come, on our perspective, it needs to be a genuine bona fide offer. And I don't think Calvinists can offer that. I don't think Calvinists can say Jesus died for you and that God really loves you. Some Calvinists attempt to try to hang on to their Calvinism and still say those kinds of things or still promote that kind of doctrine. I don't think it's consistent. I don't see how it's consistent.